this video we're going to follow the flight of an A320 between Zurich, Switzerland and Lugano in Switzerland. This is not a typical flight for the A320 because Lugano has a very short runway of around 4,200 feet.
On runway.
Normally Lugano would be serviced by twin turboprop aircraft, but as this is a simulation, we'll push the boundaries a little and we'll see if we can master the A320 for a short landing with a very steep approach. I have Aerosoft Switzerland X scenery installed on my version of FSX, and we will encounter some stunning scenery during our route. I've set the weather as fair and summertime, so we should get a good view of the ground beneath us and the mountains we're going to fly over.
On runway 3.
This flight could be replicated with totally different weather settings such as low cloud, higher winds, poor visibility, fog, etc., typical of the mountainous areas we're going to be flying through, and the flight would be a very different ballgame. So perhaps you'd like to set yourself that challenge at some point. In the meantime, we'll look at the basic flight and how we achieve our approach and landing into Lugano. First thing, we need to set our MCDU for our flight plan. So, initial page, we need to go from Zurich, which is LSZH, to Lugano, which is LSZA.
3, 4. On runway 3, 4.
SZA. Enter that into the from and to. Put in a flight number. I'll just put in 123 for the moment. Cost index 40. And our cruise level is going to be fairly low at 14,000 feet. That is the minimum altitude we are allowed to fly over the Swiss Alps.
On runway 3, 4. On runway 3, 4.
Now need to put in some performance details, so I'm going to select 2 degrees flaps for takeoff. That will give me my rotational speeds, etc. And then we shall look through various phases, and I shall put in the standard air pressure landing 1013,
on runway 3,
and I will assume a temperature of 8 degrees. Obviously this can be made more realistic if you use real-time weather. We now go to our flight plan. We have LSZH to LSZA, flight plan discontinuity in between, so let's enter our waypoints. First waypoint is to be Brego, B-R-E-G-O. Enter that. Next one will be Affolt, A-F-O-L-T. Enter that. Next one will be R-Tag, A-R.
On runway 3, 4. On runway 3, 4.
G. Next one will be Gersa, G-E-R-S-A. Scroll till we get the discontinuity and enter it there. After Gersa it will be Soson, S-O-S-O-N, S-O-S-O-N.
On runway 3, 4. On runway 3, 4.
Odina. O-D-I-N-A. Lugan. Lugan,
On runway 34. On runway 34.
Caldo, C-A-L-D-O. Scroll to discontinuity. Select the top Caldo, that will be the closest one to us. And then finally LSZA. We have a planned discontinuity here. Enter clear and enter. Go to our flight plan. Scroll to the first one. Departure airport. Select your departure. We are going to use 34. Enter runway 34. Select Lugano. Arrival. We're going to use the arrival RNV01. Enter that. Insert. You should now have a complete flight plan. I have the flight plan now on my display. If I set my MCDU to flight plan and I select this rotating knob to plan, I can then scan through my flight plan and I will see the route moving in front of me and my directions to my final destination. There should be no break in the green line. I now have a complete flight plan. I'm now going to set my cruise altitude to 14,000 feet, and I will set that as a single altitude so that we will make a steady climb to our cruise altitude without any steps in the altitude climb. I have now checked that I have fuel for the flight, and I'm going to set flaps 2 for takeoff. Flaps 2 now set. We're now ready for our takeoff roll and our climb to 14,000 feet. If we look at the flight plan here, shortly after takeoff I'm going to make a left-hand turn, a right-hand turn, a left-hand turn to pick up my designated route. If I switch my display back to ARC now, I will get a clear view, and that will enable me to alter the radius ahead of me so that I can see that plan in more or less detail as I record. I'll set it to 20 miles initially. So we're now ready for takeoff.
On runway 34. On runway 34.
Speed climbing. Lever back to climb position. Throttle in climb position. Select autopilot. Aircraft will now turn. Aircraft now turning towards its designated route. Flaps clean. Now climbing and turning away from Zurich Airport. through the low cloud. The aircraft is now levelling off and will shortly make a right-hand turn towards Brego. Our top of climb is estimated to be at this point 14,000 feet. Now turning right towards Brego. Making its left turn at Brego for the next sector. Now turning at Brego towards Affont. So we're now heading for this sector, passing through 12,600. Approaching 14,000 feet, speed reducing to be held at about 290 knots. Now ahead of the aircraft we have the Swiss Alps. We're now going to fly directly over the Swiss Alps for the time. There are some very high peaks here, hence the minimum altitude of 14,000 feet. If you replicate this flight yourself, you may well wish to go higher than that, but I've chosen that so that we get a nice view of the surrounding scenery for this particular group. The Aerosoft Switzerland X scenery is quite remarkable and very realistic. It's also ideal scenery for general aviation aircraft if you want to go sightseeing. Now reaching Artag, and we'll make a gentle right turn towards Gersa, maintaining 14,000 feet. Feet, heading of about 173, speed held, altitude cruise held, navigation held, all by the autopilot MCDU system. Now levelling out for its flight towards Gersa. Contact center on 127.6. Now, as we are in a short, straight and level section of the flight, it's worth thinking about our landing. Lugano, as I said earlier, does have a particularly short runway for this type of aircraft, and this flight is not perhaps technically correct. What we will do is use the MCDU to line this up with the runway, and we will take over and make a manual landing in the final sector. It requires a relatively low landing speed. We are going to have to extend flaps and landing gear to produce drag on the aircraft, and we need to make a fairly steep final approach, around an angle of about 6 degrees compared to the standard one of 3 degrees. So once again, when we get to our final approach, we are going to have to switch this autopilot system to manual. I will control the speed that I decide as pilot and my rate of descent as pilot. So I will take over from the MCDU route. Now, if you set weather conditions such that visibility is very poor, you have to be aware of the minimum heights on this approach, so that you may have to make, if necessary, a go. It might well be worth looking at the official approach charts for this if you need to do this in any more accuracy than I'm doing. This is purely to use the A320 for a flight of particularly interesting scenic value. We now have around 28 miles to go to reach Odina, but between my present position and Odina is my top of descent. However, looking ahead of the aircraft, you will see there is quite a ridge of mountains, and that is going to be at or around the point of descent. So I'm going to modify my rate of descent here, and I'm going to ensure that I am past that ridge of mountains before I begin my descent. My next point of descent is going to be 10,000 feet. If I look at my MCDU, at Odina I should still be at around 14,000 feet, having passed the top descent point. The next point is Lugano, and I need to be at around 10,900. Now I'm going to make that descent a little lower to give myself plenty of time for this approach. I'm going to make that 10,000 feet by the time I reach Lugano. So I'm going to enter 10,000 feet, but I'm not going to do anything about that descent until I have cleared this final ridge. I am actually now approaching my top of descent. I'm going to fly a little further before I make that descent. We don't want to descend into these mountains, beautiful though they may be. I am now approaching the final ridge of these mountains, and then I can descend into the more open valley towards the lake. Okay, now crossing the final ridge, and time for me to initiate my descent. I have the 10,000 feet already input, left click, and that is now being operated by the MCDU, and I am commencing my descent. 13,008, 13,7, beginning to descend to 10,000 feet. I shall be at around 10,000 feet. Now, let's look at our final approach. I'm going to fly towards Caldo and make a right-hand turn, then a long sweeping left-hand turn and come back to Caldo. Now, when I reach Caldo for the first time, I want to be at 6,000 feet. But by the time I have come round the curve and have come back to Caldo, I want to be at 3,000 feet. So I need to descend from my present position from 10,000 feet to 6,000 feet and down to 3,000 feet through that final turn. I am now at 10,000 feet. I'm going to reduce into my next required altitude of 6,000 feet. And as I begin to make the turn near Lugano, I'm going to input the 6,000 to make it active. Now beginning the turn at Lugano. I can now make a 6,000 feet active. Descending to 6,000 feet by the time I reach Caldo. Caldo now just under 2 miles ahead of me. 7,900 feet at present. Now as I make this final turn, I also want to reduce my speed. I'm going to take over manually now, and I'm going to right click. Present speed is 221. I'm going to reduce that to 175. Do a relatively slow final turn. I also wish to reduce my altitude to 3,000 feet. Aircraft now making this final turn and reducing. I can increase my rate of descent by right-clicking the button on the right and inputting the rate of descent that I wish to accomplish. I'm going to put in 2,000 feet per minute descent. My required airport is over here. Now I need to have my wits about me for my final approach. Here's Caldo again for the second time. I need to be at 3,000 feet. I've set 3,000, descending 2,000 feet per minute. Presently passing through 5,200 feet. Here is Lugano. I'm now going to reduce my speed to 160. Flaps 1. Here is the runway. I have a ridge in front of me. I need to be now very visually aware of what's going on. I'm going to switch the autopilot off.
1,000.
And I'm going to ensure that I clear this final ridge, reducing my speed to 140. Flaps. Gear down. Auto brake maximum. Master caution off because I've switched the autopilot off. Steep approach. Now need to concentrate. This is a very steep approach. Gear is down. Flaps are full. I need to touch down as near the end of the runway as possible to give myself maximum landing capability. 140. Full flaps. Gear down. In the simulation you'll see there are trees just in front of the runway. I also have to clear that obstacle.
Approaching 01.
500.
Unstable.
140 knots. Steep approach.
300.
Clear the trees. Throttle back.
200.
Zurich
100.
Nose.
70, 60, 50, 40,
Sorry about the
30,
aircraft.
20, 5.
Long landing. Long landing.
Full brakes. Reverse thrust.
600 meters remaining. 300 meters remaining.
And we've made it. Look at the final stages of that landing again. I'm sorry about the AI aircraft that were on the ground. It's just something that the computer generated. I should have made a go around, but for the sake of the video, I continue. You can see that it is a very steep approach. Wheels down, nose down, reverse thrust, full brakes. We made it. We take one more look at that from a different angle. Steep approach over the lake, over the trees, over the runway threshold, down as quickly as possible, main wheels down, nose wheel down, reverse thrust, full brakes. Welcome to Lugano. Now, although we are safely down on the runway, we have one other minor obstacle. There is no turning circle on this particular airport. So we need to put the nose wheel on the extremity of the edge of the runway, and then a maximum left turn, maximum rudder, possible differential braking to bring the aircraft around within the width of the runway. It can just about be there.
On runway 19.
Then taxi back to the parking lot.
On runway 19.
You have to use the main runway as a taxiway at Lugano. So I will now head for the gate. So taxiing back now on the main runway. I'm going to turn off shortly and find a safe parking area. And that is the flight from Zurich to Lugano. It's quite a challenging flight. You may have to make a few attempts before you actually master that final run. But it's really good fun. Once again, I do wish to reiterate that the A320 may not be the aircraft which is in normal service at Lugano. But this gives an opportunity to put the aircraft to some of its extreme capabilities and for the pilot to master the various autopilot systems. So welcome to Lugano. Beautiful part of the world. Hope you enjoyed that, and the best of luck when you attempt the flight.